He turned his miserable gaze upon his one wretched pillow, dirty from his head, for he had grown remiss in having his bath since the weather got so chilly and the women down there made such a fuss about hot water. He unlaced his boots. His socks were a sight. I must do something about all this, he thought. I can't go on like this. He took down his pajamas from a hook behind the door and surveyed the cold, thin cotton sheets and the frayed edge of the cheap blanket. I'm damned if I'll take off my vest and drawers, he thought. Just for tonight. This just for tonight had been repeated ever since the middle of September. Mr. Barter, the sturdy fenman, was certainly becoming degenerate. He turned off the light and got into bed. I can't go on like this, he repeated. And he set himself to do what he disliked extremely to do, to consider his financial position. He had saved up, since his parents died, leaving him nothing, exactly £1,000. He remembered the day when, in his balance book received from Mr. Robert Stilley, he had first beheld the figure of that sum. It was just before John came. It was when he was going about with Mary. To have saved £1,000, all earned by yourself, when you were only 35, that was something as things went to England nowadays. No, he could not. He must not break into that 1,000. But what could he do if he didn't break into it? Until the factory was really on a production basis, he had to get on as best he could. His dinners at the Pilgrims' always cost him 5 shillings. That is, if he had 2 bottles of ale. And he must have ale. Ale to his meat. Ale to his pudding. It might not be a gentleman's taste, but it was his taste. He had been a fool to leave Philip, but there it was. How was he to know then, what he knew now, that he'd have this brute Robinson to work with? He tried to imagine himself back again with Philip, but somehow, miserable though he was, those galling, rankling insults, no, they were worse than his present nervousness with Robinson. At any rate, he could hardly despise Robinson, even while he recognized the man's infernal industry. And he couldn't despise Philip. He hated them both. But it was better to live with what you loathed and despised than with what you loathed and admired. God, how it was raining tonight. And how the wind howled. You remember the look of the old chimney stack on the wretched house as he came just now along those few yards of streaming pavement. It looked damnably shaky as the rain beat against it. You wouldn't wonder if one of those nights and didn't come down. And what room would it be hit? His, of course. His room. What a nice death that would be. Crushed under that filthy ceiling, covered with bricks, cement, and wet mortar. Who would have my 1,000 then? One of those fourth removed Warwickshire cousins? I must certainly make my will, thought Mr. Barter. And I'll leave every penny of that 1,000 to toss. God, those rickety old houses, how they do shake in a storm. He began to hope that Tossie wasn't frightened by this high wind in her room at the back of the Benedict house. I suppose if she gets scared, he said to himself, she'll call out and Miss Crow would go to her. And Barter's mind went through the process. It took less than half a second of summoning up the image of Miss Elizabeth and giving this image his hearty commendation. He did not articulate this in the sort of words that would have spoken, such as Miss Crow is a decent sort, or Miss Crow is the only lady in the whole blooming family except Mary. But it was as if towards the portly figure of Miss Crow he gave a sort of mental nod, as a man entering the Salon Carré in the Louvre might give a nod towards the Mona Lisa, as much as to say, so you are there still. His reflections were interrupted by an unusual noise His heart gave a most unpleasant jump. Some door on the landing below, the house was let in single and double rooms, had been flung open and a voice was shrieking. "Call the doctor, someone! Who's there? Someone must go for a doctor at once!" Mr. Barter was for a moment tempted to pull that cotton sheet and the two thin blankets tightly over his head. If a person is fast asleep, he thought, they can't disturb a person. "Mrs. Smith! Betsy Burt!" screamed the voice on the landing below. "It is extraordinary how fast I sleep. I was deep asleep then and never heard a sound." These were the words that passed through Barter's head as his excuse on the following morning. But the curious thing was that even while he was completing these rigmarole, he was already out of bed, striking matches, lighting the gas, and pulling on his trousers. Mr. Barter's arms and legs, it appeared, were more benevolent than his thoughts. Not only did he pull on his trousers, but he hurriedly began putting on his boots. That done, he went to his door and threw it open. "1 minute down there," he cried. "1 minute, and I'll go." He flung on his waistcoat, coat and overcoat, snatched up his cap, shut his door, and ran downstairs. It appeared that the child of a solitary and rather unpleasant woman, who lived in the room parallel to his own on the floor below, had been taken with some kind of fit. It was a little boy of 6, and the child was now, as Barter pushed Mrs. Carey and Betsy Burt aside, lying on the bed with a ghastly white face and his eyes tightly shut. "'Tis convulsions, Mr. Barter," said Betsy Burt, when he pushed his way in. "'Tis apocalypse, mister," cried old Mrs. Carey, "for I do know how it take him. 'Twere apocalypse that thee own blood brother died of, Miss Burt. So you ought to be the one to talk of convulsions. But I do know. I've seen on and handled on in many a corpsey, and they was all took just as this child be. He's gone already. Looks so to I. First they gets red, and then they get turbled white. 'Pocalypse takes the hearts. No, and that's what do make their colour fly." The woman who screams in the middle of the night had brought nobody out of bed but Mr. Barter and these two crones, was kneeling on the floor, frantically chafing the hands of her child. "I'll bring the doctor here in 5 minutes," Barter said, touching her on the shoulder, but the woman did not turn around. Did not, as a matter of fact, take any notice at all. "She were home late last night, mister," said old Mrs. Carey, tugging at his coat as he hurried out. "Don't tell doctor I said it. Don't bring no inquest tales on I." She called after him as he went downstairs. It didn't take him long, for as he ran fast all the way, butting against the deluging rain like a Norfolk gamekeeper, to reach Dr. Feld's house at the corner of Northload Street. Luckily, though it was long past 12, the doctor was still reading the Enchiridion in his study. Enchiridion? Enchiridion. Maybe one of my hundreds of followers could look that up and leave definition in the comments. In other words, his favorite book was open on his knees and his broad, low forehead, with the grizzled hair sticking out of it like the bristles of an aged hog, was nodding above the book. He opened the street door himself and let Mr. Barter in. He agreed to go at once, but when they opened the door again to make a start, the rain was so terrific that he begged his summoner to wait till he got back. "Then I can send anything by you, Barter, that they may want. Besides, no use you're getting wetter than you are. It can't go on like this. I know the house. There's whiskey on my table, man, and a glass somewhere. Take a good pill. It'll do you good." "That's nice of him." It was an incredible comfort to Mr. Barter to pour himself out a half tumbler of whiskey and water, and draw in his chair close to the red coals. He made towards his friend, the doctor, the same sort of mental nod of inarticulate approval that he had made towards Miss Crow. A warm glow of the first that he had made, the first unadulterated pleasure he had had since he had last saw Miss Stickles, ran through his veins as he gulped down the good drinks and dried his wet boots at the fire. I believe I'll give up my dinners at the Pilgrims', he thought, and buy whiskey with that money. Drinks are better than the best cooking when a man's got the doldrums. It's sadly true. Half an hour passed. Barter went to the doctor's table and poured himself out half a glass more, which he now proceeded to sip without putting it in any water. He moved to the doctor's big leather chair and placed his glass upon the floor. A delicious drowsiness began to flow through him like a ripple of warm, etherealized honey. In an hour the doctor returned. "He'll be all right, the little lad," he said cheerfully. It was that kind of mock epilepsy that children sometimes get. "He's asleep now, and so, I hope, is the mother. There's no hurry for you to go, my boy. Wait till the rain's subsided. Let's make a night of it. I've got plenty more of that stuff. It's good, isn't it? That woman will kill that child with her drunken ways unless I get that society to take him away from her." He went on when they had settled down. "Do you know that I know at this moment 1, 2, 5 mothers that are killing their children in their town?" "Well, they'll be out of it when they're dead," said Thomas Barter. That's true. "And do you realize, my good friend, that little Titty Petherton's cancer is following a track that won't kill her for months and months, maybe not for 6 months. I made sure it would finish her off in a week or two, when I examined her in August, but not at all. Well, in a year anyway, she will be dead and all that pain wiped out." "Wiped out, Barter? What are you talking about? Are you such a happy man as really to believe that the whole sweep and surge and swing of things, pain like that, is wiped out? I read a Russian book once, Barter, by the man whose name begins with D. The character there says he believes in God but rejects God's world. Now I feel just the opposite. I think the whole of God's world is infinitely to be pitied, tortured and torturers alike. But I think that God himself, the great living God, responsible for it all, the powerful creator who deliberately gave such reptiles, such sharks, such hyenas, such jackals as we are, as a curious gift of free will, ought to have such a cancer." The quiet doctor actually jerked himself forward to the edge of his armchair till, with only the tip of his buttocks, where his erect and angry tail would have been, switching if he had possessed one, resting upon its very verge, he drew with his forefinger a cruel outline upon the air. "Such a cancer," he cried, "as would keep him alive and howling for 1,000,000 years." "I went through paradise yesterday," remarked Barter. "The poverty's pretty bad down there still, in spite of it all, this new work that Crow's been giving people." The doctor, who had now relapsed, panting into the depths of his chair, took up the subject with a groan. "I should think it was pretty bad. It's a few of the natives who get the work. He's brought in a lot of new men from Bristol and Bath, of stronger, better fed type, and more docile, too. There will be another riot before our folks expect it, and a much more serious one than the little affair at the pageant when they mobbed Lord P. What do you think, Doctor, will really come of all these diggings and buildings out of that well? Do you think Gerd will get a steady crowd down there every year? Or only just on the one day he opens the thing? John was telling me it would be open between Christmas and the end of January. The 1st of January. "My good friend," said Charles Montague Fell, pointing at Barter with the stem of his cherry wood pipe, "what people forget is this. In all these improvements, whether Gerd brings them in or Crow, the real pain of mind and body goes on where people haven't the heart or the health to get the benefit of such things. That's a point they've always forgotten. I'm a doctor, and a doctor's profession naturally with the unfit rather than the fit. And I tell you, the tragedy of life is in the rubbish heap. People talk of the sufferings of the strong, and how you ought to help the strong rather than the weak, as if the weak were a type of animal that didn't feel. I tell you, suffering is like a fungus that the strong can carry about with them and still bustle and strut, whereas with the weak the fungus is too heavy. They can't hold it up. It pulls them down. But it don't numb their feelings. They're nothing else but feeling. Feeling and fungus. Well, we'll leave it on that word, feeling and fungus. That's what I am. Till next time. Cheers.